When I say orchid, what do you think of? If you're like most people, you think of this, the Phalaenopsis. But did you know that there are over 1,000 genera of orchid, and then there are 2,800 species of orchid, and then also there's 100,000 plus hybrids. So today we are going to talk about why orchids make great houseplants. There is so much more than Phalaenopsis in orchids, and I love Phalaenopsis. There are so many more. There is an orchid for everyone. There is an orchid if you have a low light apartment. There's an orchid if you have a high light apartment. You can even modify the lighting if you have a dark apartment, supplemental lighting. Orchids are the best plants and do so well under artificial lighting. They don't necessarily need natural light. The more natural light they get, obviously, is probably better, but you can grow orchids with supplemental lighting. And it doesn't have to be the fancy grow lights that are expensive. You can just get a regular shop light and put a light in there and call it a day. With that said, let's start why I feel like orchids make great houseplants. One, you can plant them in just about anything. You can plant them in a bark and moss mix. You can plant them in just moss. You can put them on a mount with moss or without. Just note that if you do put it on a mount without any moss, you will need to water it more often. Depending on your environment, you may need to water it twice a day or 3, 4, 5, 6 times a day, again, depending on the orchid, depending on your environment. You can also grow them in just large perlite, and you can also grow them in leca. You can grow them in charcoal, you can grow them in water, you can grow them in air. You don't have to put them on anything. Most orchids are epiphytic, and they do prefer to have something to put their roots on, but not necessarily. Vandas are usually grown on just a hanger or an airy basket. In the airy basket, they grab on the roots, but I've also seen them just on a hanger. Another thing that I enjoy is the selection. Like I said before, 2,800 species, 100,000 plus hybrids. That's a lot to choose from. Just to give you an example of the different types of orchids there are besides Phalaenopsis, we have your Vandas, we have Cattleyas, we have your species Phalaenopsis, you have a Cymbidium back here, you've got Oncidium. Ooh, let me move some of these other way, like this big girl here. Your Zygonesia, Zygopetalums, you've got Miltoniopsis, you've got Miltonias, you've got your Brassavolas, you've got your Angraecoids, Bulbophyllums. I'm trying to think what else we have out there. Bulbophyllums, Angraecoids, already said those. But moving on, a lot of the orchids as well their flowers have a fragrance. Your Cattleyas are the most popular as far as being known for their fragrance. Many of the Cattleyas have a flower smell to them. A lot of people detect some type of a rose in them and then other scents that go with it, but usually there's always a rose undertone. However, I have a Potnera Dick Smith Paradise that to me smells like magnolias. So everyone has a different detection of scent. So depending on how you smell things and what your brain recognizes, you may smell something different than me. Also, they come in different shapes and sizes. So like I said, we've got this Cattleya here, and some of these can get ginormous. You've got your species Phalaenopsis that look completely different than your hybrid Phalaenopsis. They do both have the big leaves, they have similar growth patterns. However, your species Phalaenopsis tend to have shinier leaves, and a lot of their leaves are a lot lighter. They also, 90% of them do have a scent and are continuous bloomers. Let's see, what else do we have here that's scent? Your Brassavolas, majority of them and your Brassavola crosses do have a scent, but they are scented at night because they are pollinated by moths, and obviously moths aren't out during the day, so there's that. Your Miltoniopsis and Miltonias, your Zygonesias, your Zygopetalums. Some of your Oncidiums have a smell, such as this one here, my Sherry Baby, that I have a series on, but this is the Sherry Baby. She is known as the chocolate orchid. There are several different varieties of the Sherry Baby, and some people smell vanilla chocolate. Some people smell dark chocolate. Some people smell a combination of different chocolates. There are varying different smells in each one. Also, their need to survive. Most houseplants, if they lose their roots, they're pretty much on their way out. It's very hard to save a houseplant once the roots are gone. With orchids, however, what they do, if they drop their roots, a lot of them have storage organs. Let me find one. I keep picking up the Sherry Baby. Let me pick up a different one. Let me pick up this Twinkle here. And this Twinkle is a smaller version of an Oncidium. So this is in the Oncidium family, it's just smaller. But if you look right here, do you see this pseudobulb? That has nutrients, water, whatever the plant needs while the new growths are growing. So if she had dropped all of her roots and had no roots, these storage organs will provide for the plant until the newer growths develop new roots to take over. And then if those storage organs had shriveled, they fill back up. Also, if you have, for instance, a Phalaenopsis who has a terminal spike. So do you see the little stick right there? That's an old spike. Well, once they have a spike in the center of the crown, they're not going to produce any more leaves or flowers. And what happens is they will, in time, produce a baby. Do you see that right there? That's called a keiki, which is a orchid baby. A lot of your orchids produce keikis, your Phalaenopsis, your Dendrobiums. I know that Vandas can produce keikis. And with those keikis, and in this case, it is, I'm going to keep it because it's basically replacing Mama. But let's just use this one here, for instance. Say this keiki here, okay? The bigger leaves that you see right here, that's the rest of Mama. The bulk of her, this part here, is a keiki. And if you turn it around, you can see where she grew out of the center. Well, I can now take this keiki off if I wanted to because these roots are absorbing water, plus she has roots from the keiki inside the media. I can either share it, keep it, or in the case of, say, a Dendrobium, if you take the keiki off, if you wanted to make a fuller pot, you can just plunk it in there with the mama plant. So you can increase your collection or increase your pot with the same plant just by their reproduction. Another thing that I love, and it's probably my favorite thing, is the blooms. Depending on the size of your collection and what type of orchid you have, you can have blooms year-round. Some are forced into blooming, like our Phalaenopsis that we buy in the store, or especially around Mother's Day when they bring in Cattleyas and maybe a Miltonia sold as a Miltoniopsis sold as a Miltonia, so be very careful with that, or an Oncidium. Sometimes you can, like, they force them into blooming. I mean, think about it, they're in the nursery, they're in perfect conditions, they can manipulate things better than we can in our home. Generally, when they come in bloom, like I was showing you with the Phalaenopsis earlier that was in full bloom, I don't know how long those blooms are going to last because I don't know how long she was in bloom before I purchased her. The Looseberry, however, that still had some buds on her, I know she's going to be in bloom for at least 2 to 3 months. Your Phalaenopsis hybrids are known to be in bloom for a minimum of 3 months. They can be in bloom for up to a year if they continue to extend that spike, or sometimes what they'll do is they will branch. But this right here, do you see her blooms are starting to go over? She's starting to really lose her blooms. Once all these blooms are gone, I'll probably cut the spike when I'm done. She's not going to bloom off this again once these blooms drop. So it is okay to cut the spike. Now, some people leave the spike on. She can branch and produce another spike to bloom off of, but she's never going to bloom off of this stem again. I personally, once the blooms are done, I cut the spike. I don't care about the branching. I'm not that impressed with it. To me, I find that the blooms aren't quite as showy and pretty and numerous as the original. Now, your summer or novelty Phalaenopsis are what they're known as sequential bloomers. And you also have like your Psychopsis, and I can't think of any other orchid, but I know there's other ones out there. Those are the two that just pop into my head right now. So a sequential bloomer, what it will do is it will continue to grow the stem or the spike and continue to bloom off of it. So I've had this manii since the 14th of July. I've gotten 4 blooms so far from her, and she is also now working on 2 more blooms for me. Now, so far the blooms haven't lasted but maybe a week. I do know that there are some species, Phalaenopsis, novelty Phalaenopsis, that the blooms can last up to a month. But with this one so far, and it may just be her acclimating to my climate and my environment in the living room, she may keep them longer as time progresses. So this right here, you don't want to cut until it turns yellow or brown, then she's done blooming off of it. Another great thing about orchids is the satisfaction you get when you finally get the culture right. When you finally get the right media, the right lighting, the right watering, the right fertilizing, everything is right. The orchid says, you know what, you did a good job, let me reward you. And they reward you with this. So this is a no-ID Dendrobium Phalaenopsis, and this will be the first reblooming for me since I've gotten her. When I first got her, she grew this really small growth right here, and then she kicked out this growth here for me, and then now she's going to reward me with these blooms. So that is, to me, the best feeling, is when you have an orchid that you've been caring for, especially like my Zygonesia right here that I've had since 2019. She finally rebloomed for me this year, and it was just absolutely amazing. The feeling of success. And they teach you to be patient. They teach you to learn them, because all of these kind of have the same requirements, but each one has a little tweak that it likes. For instance, the Miltoniopsis right here, this one right here, prefers to stay moist, whereas your Cattleyas don't mind if they are dry for a little bit. They actually prefer what they call a wet-dry cycle. So it is best to try to figure out what works best in your environment as far as media. So if you have a very high humidity, hot environment, then find out what media works best for you. I prefer to do a mixture of things. I have some orchids, like I said, in all bark. I have some mounted. I have some in a bark moss mix. I have some in just a bark. I have some in bark with perlite. I have it all in a little bit of everything. When you have these, so this, let's go back to the Phalaenopsis. The only tweak that you need to do with these is remember that they do not like to be dry. So just as the media approaches dryness, and you can kind of see she's getting a little dry in there, then you want to water her. But otherwise, most of the orchids don't mind a dry cycle in between their waterings. So when do you water an orchid? Well, you water an orchid like you water a houseplant, when it needs to be watered. If it is bone dry, give it some water. If it's still a little wet and you figured out that that orchid can handle a little more dryness, wait a day or two. It's better to be more on the dry side with orchids than on the wet side. Another thing is temperatures. A lot of people are under the misconception that orchids require high heat or really cool temperatures for some of them, but most of them can grow in what we call intermediate conditions, which means if you're comfortable in the space that you're growing your orchids, they're going to be okay. Now, there are some who do require a little bit of tweaking, and you can create little microclimates around those, like those that do need to have a little more humidity in order to stay healthy and thriving. You can create humidity trays. You can put them in a decorative pot with a little bit of pebbles at the bottom and leave just enough water to create that extra humidity. For those that need higher light, and let's just say your space doesn't have quite the light that that orchid requires, you can buy a grow light, not necessarily an actual grow light. You can get a shop light, put a LED light in there, and boom, you've got extra lighting. So there are workarounds to the orchids who do have those special needs, but they don't all need special needs. 90% of them will grow in intermediate temperatures and in bright shade. Now, if you have an orchid that is growing for you, it's doing well for you, and it's never bloomed, increase the light on it, and most of the time it'll go ahead and bloom for you, because that's kind of what triggered it to bloom. Orchids, to me, make great houseplants because there's a lot of popular trending houseplants right now that require way more special needs than many of the orchids. take your ficus, and then what is that? The calathea, a lot of your monstera type, those big leafy ones. They require, you know, higher humidity and special lighting, and you got to put them in a little box, and you don't have to do that with 90% of the orchids. I do enjoy houseplants. I still have some houseplants. I don't plan on buying any more houseplants. I feel like I'm going to just focus on my orchids. They just make great plants. Even when they don't have blooms on them, I enjoy looking at their difference in their texture. For instance, this Cattleya, and then look at the Brassivola. Look at the difference. I mean, yeah, they're both green, but look at the difference in their leaves. Like, this is all long and spindly, almost grass-like, but, you know, hard grass. And then you've got the Cattleya with its lime green, and then the growth pattern of this Phalaenopsis. To me, that is just interesting. And a lot of people say, oh, well, you know, if they're not in bloom, they're just green. Well, you know what? Almost 99% of our houseplants are just green. A lot of them don't have a point of interest, like their leaves aren't textured, or they don't have a pattern, they're just green. So to me, that's not a good enough reason why orchids don't make great houseplants. If you have any thoughts on why orchids make great houseplants, if you agree with me or if you disagree, leave it in the comments down below so we can all learn from each other as far as what we think is a good houseplant orchid. And with that, I enjoyed your company, and I hope you come back again soon, and I will see you then.